Trophy, the current top division in England, Scotland. You have that here. We've won 42 domestic cups, 42 Scottish cups. We're the record title holder in that competition. Nobody's won more Scottish cups than we have. We've also won 21 League Cups, the third domestic honour in Scottish football. Now, if you add those numbers up, that takes you up to 117 major honours, but our total is 118. That extra one is made up of this trophy down here, the European Cup. If you want to see the European Cup or Champions League, whatever you want to call it, if you want to see that trophy in Scotland, you're in the only place where that's possible, because we're, of course, the only Scottish team to ever win that tournament, to ever win that trophy. Many have tried, some have chased that dream, and it's been ultimately to their detriment, to their ruin. But Celtic did it first. We were very, very successful. That was part of our most successful period, the 60s and 70s. That was the nadir of it. That was the ultimate peak of Celtic's history. So I dare say we might touch on that here or there throughout the tour as well. That might be mentioned. Now, as I mentioned, our club was founded back in 1887. The guy who is most often credited as being the founder of Celtic is a gentleman called Brother Walfrid. He was born as Andrew Kerins in a place called Ballymote in County Sligo in Ireland. You can actually see just behind you guys there, there's a bust of him on the back. That's Brother Walfrid, the man that started Celtic. Now, he was a Marist brother. It's a Catholic religious order where the main focus is on faith through education, if you like. The Marists ran schools, and that was what Walfrid did. He went on courses that were put on by the Marist brothers. He learned he studied that. He also learned French. He travelled to Marseille, where he became indoctrinated into the Marist brothers. And when he was done in France, he came here to Glasgow, where he had lived from the age of about 15 until he was in his early 20s. Walfrid, while he was here, before he joined the Marist brothers, he had worked on the railways. He was a working class man. He came from a very modest background back in Ireland. And like many others, he had came to Glasgow from Ireland due to the famine that had occurred in the mid-19th century. So Walfrid found himself in Glasgow in the 1880s, freshly minted as a new teacher. He got employment here in the city, and he found employment in the city's Catholic schools. Although getting students to attend those schools was tough, because many families simply didn't have the means to send their kids to school. The level of poverty in the Irish community in Glasgow at that point in time was abject. It was incredibly stark. And I think it's fair to say it broke Walfrid's heart to see people from his community, his background, his people suffering like that. It was out of that crucible that Celtic was formed. The mission statement for Celtic back in those days, back in 1887, 1888, was that a club shall be formed for the maintenance of dinner tables for the children and the unemployed. We were formed as a charity to help those who've been forgotten by wider Scottish society. So that's where we came from. And even though we were formed as a charity, as an amateur side, as all sides were amateur, technically speaking, at that point in time, we were nevertheless very, very successful. By the end of our first season, we had played in 3 different cup finals, including the Scottish Cup final, where unfortunately we were defeated. We won our first trophy at the very end of our first season. It was a fairly modest honour. It was the Glasgow North Eastern Cup, just a regional cup for teams from this part of the city. But it is what kick-started all of this. All this success we've enjoyed over the last nearly 140 odd years all comes from winning that first trophy. We don't have that trophy with us here in Celtic Park at the moment. We do have one of the medals though. It was given to one of the players from that, and that's just here at the very front of the cabinet. So make sure you get a look at that when you have a chance. That medal was awarded to a guy called Willie Mele. Now, the Celtic fans in the room, you'll all be familiar with Willie Mele. Those of you who've joined us from abroad are maybe less familiar with Willie Mele. I'll give you a brief history of him. He was a part of Celtic's very first ever starting 11. Celtic's first game was in the spring of 1888, and it was, as you may expect, it was a game against Rangers, our great rivals. We played the very first derby match between Celtic and Rangers. Willie Mele was a part of that team, and Celtic won 5-2. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Right? So that was how Celtic got started, and Willie Mele was a part of that start. He also functioned as the team's secretary. He was sort of like the manager of the club. Throughout his 9-year playing career, he was basically the manager of Celtic. In 1897, he became the manager in earnest, our very first manager, our first full-time honest-to-God manager. He held that job from 1897 until 1940 when he retired. 43 years he reigned as Celtic manager. He spent over 52 years working for the club in some capacity, well over half of his life. So much of what Celtic became over the years, so much of what Celtic is now comes from him. And he had many great Celtic teams that had many wonderful achievements. Chief amongst them, we won a couple of British Championships, tournaments that featured teams from Scotland and England. So we won the British League Cup in 1902. We beat Rangers in the final of that tournament. We beat them 3-2. Jimmy Quinn, great striker for us in the 1900s. He scored a hat-trick to pull us from 2-0 down to win the match 3-2. Interestingly though, that story has that trophy, has a bit of a complicated backstory. So before it was the British League Cup, it was used for a different tournament called the Glasgow Exhibition, and when it was known under that name, when it was the Glasgow Exhibition Trophy, Rangers actually won it. So there's an inscription on this trophy here that says won by Rangers FC, but you won't see that inscription because we've turned it back to front. I don't think anybody wants to see that. So that's one of Willie Mele's great honours, becoming champions of Britain for the very first time. We've won another such trophy of that type. Here, the 1938 Empire Exhibition Trophy defeated Everton in the final of that. They would go on to be the champions of England the following season. Perhaps his greatest achievement was winning 6 league titles in a row from 1904 to 1910. That was a world record at that point in time. For that achievement, we were gifted this shield from the Scottish Football League. So to mark the 6 league titles in a row, you'll see on that shield there are 6 rings, 3 on the left and 3 on the right. Inside those rings inscribed are the names of all the players who took part season by season. The guy who I mentioned a few minutes ago, Jimmy Quinn, his name is inscribed inside all 6 of those rings. He was a great striker for us in the early 20th century. He signed for us in 1900 and he left us in 1915, spent his entire professional career at Celtic Park, and he was a great player for us. Scored, to my knowledge, it was 217 goals that he scored. He's our 5th top goal scorer of all time. Even now, over 100 years, 110 years almost after he retired from the sport. One of our all-time greats. He came from a place called Croy, just to the northeast of the city. I'm going to hazard a guess that our guests from Mexico and the Netherlands and the States don't know where Croy is. It's just to the northeast. It's a small village just outside the city. It was a prominent mining community. That was where Jimmy Quinn came from. And he was very attached to his home and to his family. So he actually almost didn't sign for Celtic because he was afraid to leave home. He was eventually convinced that he could stay in Croy and still play for Celtic. To do that, he would have to get the train from Croy train station to Glasgow Queen Street and then get the tram for the city centre out here to Celtic Park to play for Celtic. Celtic's star striker in the 1900s used public transport to come to the games. I think that's wonderful. That's one of my favourite aspects of his story because it's just so hard to imagine now with modern sensibilities. You're not going to see someone like Kyogo Furuhashi on the 255 bus anytime soon. But back in the 1900s, you might very well have seen Jimmy Quinn, the mighty Quinn they called him. And because he came from Croy and he got public transport to come here as well, he was also known as the Croy Express. That was a wee in-joke with his teammates. But a great, great player for us. Part of the reason why I mentioned him as well, this jersey down here in the frame, that's one of Jimmy Quinn's match-worn tops that he wore for Celtic. So that jersey is potentially the oldest set of hoops in existence. It's hard to say for certain. Certainly one of the oldest sets of hoops. We've tried dating it roughly. We think that it comes from 1911, 1912. We're pretty satisfied that it is a Jimmy Quinn jersey. It's just a case of it's hard to actually identify when it was worn, when exactly. But part of one of the identifiers, I suppose, of it being a Jimmy Quinn jersey, he was a very aggressive, very impactful sort of player. He was as likely to run through a defender as he was to run past them. He was very, very powerful. So you can tell it's a Quinn jersey by the fact that it's got blood stains in the front of it. So that's the kind of player that he was. I dare say that's not the only one of his tops that's got some blood stains on it over the years. So he was a great player for us, one of our great pre-war heroes. Now, as Willie Mele's time as manager went on, over the course of all this happening, as I say, he's still manager. He remained manager until 1940, but through the 20s, 30s, and into the early 40s, into the war, things started to slow down for Celtic. We stopped playing quite as well as we had been before. We weren't as dominant as we had been in the first few years, the first couple of decades of Mele's tenure as manager. In 1945, we appointed a guy called James McGrory as club manager. James McGrory is a Celtic legend. He is the greatest striker in the history of this football club. He's arguably the greatest striker in the history of British football. He is the British football top goal scorer, all-time top goal scorer. Across his career, scored 550 goals in 545 games. Literally scored more goals than he played games. A fantastic football player. I mentioned earlier, so Arsenal, he said he scored, yeah. At one point in time, Arsenal were interested in signing James McGrory. This would have been in the late 20s, early 30s. They were interested in signing James McGrory. He knocked back the chance to play for Arsenal because he didn't want to leave Celtic. He said that McGrory of Arsenal never sounded as good as McGrory of Celtic. But Arsenal were offering a lot of money to compensate Celtic for buying Mr McGrory. So Celtic were quite keen to sell him. And the story goes that when he then knocked back the move to go down to London, the board at the time, not best pleased with this, decided to punish James McGrory by lowering his pay ever so slightly, giving him a fine basically for not moving on to make the club more money. McGrory, he was fine with that though. He said it's a small price to pay to keep playing for Celtic. That's how committed he was to the cause of Celtic Football Club. A wonderful football player for us. As a manager, though, his record is a bit hit or miss. He was manager for about 20 years, from 1945 to 1965, and we did have success. We won a league and cup double in 1954. We had a very famous day in 1957. Again, Celtic fans will know about this. 1957, we beat our great rivals Rangers 7-1 at Hampden in the Scottish League Cup final. That remains a record in British football as well for the highest scoring cup final. It's tied with the Manchester City Cup win 40 years ago. Nevertheless, great achievement. However, James McGrory, he was thought of perhaps as being a little bit too nice to be a manager, not ruthless enough, not pragmatic enough. And over time, Celtic's results started to wane again. Into the early 60s, it was very quickly become a bit of a fallen giant. No one really thought about Celtic in the same way as they had done before. We weren't quite as big as some other teams around. In stature, yes. I mean, the largest fan base in the country at that point in time, absolutely. But in terms of success, things are going back. We weren't the same things we had before. So in 65, things had to change. The board decided to make a change, to bring in a new young manager to take us through the next generation. Celtic had a very promising young team in the early mid-60s, but it was full of unrealised potential. They wanted to bring in a coach that could realise it and that could make it a reality. So they brought in a guy called Jock Stein, who had previously been a player for Celtic. And as a player, he had been solid, dependable, very, very decent, but slightly unremarkable. He was a defender. He was all right. He was a perfectly fine football player. But as I say, unremarkable as a player for Celtic. The word remarkable, though, that's the most modest way that you could describe Jock Stein as a coach, as a manager. As a manager, he was a completely different animal. The degree to which he changed Celtic's fortunes in the space of 18 months, 2 years, is absolutely unbelievable. He took us on board in 1965, in March 65. Later on that season, quite early on in his Celtic tenure, he won the Scottish Cup, his first trophy as Celtic manager. That enabled us the following year to compete in the Cup Winners' Cup. We went to the semi-finals of that tournament. That was the furthest we had been in Europe up to that point in time. We were knocked out by Liverpool in the semi-finals. On the domestic front, in the 65-66 season, we won our first league title for 12 years. We've been 12 years without a title. That 54 double was the last time we had won it. 66, we became champions. Great. In and of itself, a fantastic achievement. But what made it even more special was that it meant for the very first time Celtic would get to compete in the European Cup the following year, in the 66-67 season. Now, we had never competed in that tournament before. 66-67 was the very first year that Celtic played in what is now the Champions League. As such, expectations were not particularly high amongst the support or amongst neutrals. But expectations were very high inside Celtic Park. Jock Stein knew that we had the potential to do something special that year. And so he set out to do just that. Celtic went all the way to the final, which was hosted in Lisbon, Portugal, on the 25th of May 1967. They faced off against Internazionale, Italy. One of the finest football teams in the world at that point. They had already won the tournament twice in the previous 3 years. They had knocked out the reigning champions, Real Madrid, in the quarter-finals. They were a footballing phenomenon. They played a style of football called catenaccio, which you may be familiar with. It's not known for being particularly nice to watch. It's not exactly beautiful football, but it's incredibly effective. And it made Inter one of the most feared teams in Europe. The one man who perhaps had absolutely no fear of them, however, was Jock Stein. He knew his Celtic team could beat Inter. They just had to keep going. They just had to be relentless. Just had to keep attacking. And that was the Celtic way at that point in time. Just attack ferociously, relentlessly, completely without fear. And that's exactly what we did. It's very different from how Celtic have tended to play in Europe in the last 20, 25 years, where we've been a bit more negative and a bit more cautious. Back in the 60s, we were able to take the game to these teams, and we did so in that final. It is one of the most one-sided finals in the history of the competition. If you haven't seen the highlights before, I would encourage you to seek them out. You'll be amazed to see that the giants of Inter Milan were completely helpless against Celtic. Celtic absolutely battered them. Celtic registered 42 shots in the game. 18 of them were on target. If it weren't for a fantastic performance from Giacomo Sarti in the Inter goal, it would have been a cricket score that day. But as it was, his incredible performance prevented that fate for Inter. And the game finished a much more modest 2-1. Inter actually took the lead 7 minutes in. They scored a penalty to give them the lead. Now, anyone who knew Inter at that point in time would be thinking that was game over because they would guard that lead very, very well. But Celtic kept going. An hour in, Tommy Gemmell, the late great Tommy Gemmell, an absolute thunderbolt from outside the box, makes it one each. 5 minutes from time, Stevie Chalmers, again, the late great Stevie Chalmers, scores the most important goal in Celtic's history, the most important goal in Scottish football history, to make Celtic the champions of Europe. Quite simply, the greatest achievement in the history of Scottish football, arguably the greatest achievement in the history of British football. I would say that. I'm a Celtic fan and a Celtic employee, so I'm incredibly biased in that. So you're welcome to disagree with me, but for me, it doesn't get any better than the Lisbon Lions. 11 local lads taking on the best team that Europe had to offer, and not just beating them, but thoroughly outplaying them. A wonderful story, quite unlike anything else you see in football these days. So, folks, we have another few minutes in here. I'm aware that there's a great deal of trophies that we have in this cabinet that I haven't really spoken about. So while we're still in here, before the next tour comes in, you're welcome to ask me any questions you like. If you want me to take any pictures or anything like that as well, again, please do seek me out. I'm absolutely happy to help with that. And when we're ready to move on, we're going to head through the two doors at the top of the there. All right. Thank you very much.